Today we will be kicking off with our first event on making investment work hard for greener, more resilient transport. One note is that this session is supported by HBT, but also Climate Compatible Growth, CCG for short, and CCG is funded by the FCDO, the UK's Foreign Commonwealth Development Office.
If you wish to ask a question throughout the event, please use Slido. The link is www.slido.com and the code is 2715656. The information should all be online for you, and also there are banners around the room if you wish to use it. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you our chair of the session, Henry Kerali. He works at HVT and he is a formerly World Bank Country Director working for the University of Birmingham. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, and apologies for the slight technical hitch. I'm going to beg your forgiveness and read a little bit of my introduction just to make sure that I do not miss anything very important. First of all, good transport infrastructure in particular requires significant investment in time and funds. Transport investments can become focused on short-term priorities if there are no planning tools that look at the longer-term impacts. To answer these questions, we need economies that can sustain the financing and implementation of transport infrastructure. In this particular case, we want to make sure that infrastructure planning and development takes into account the longer-term needs, particularly for the greener and more resilient to climate change implementation. This session will explore where and how decision support tools and data can do better to plan for transport infrastructure that meet economic needs of low-income countries, as well as the urgent need for low-carbon transport. Without much further ado, I will introduce the three sessions. First will be by Martin Humphries, a former colleague who is lead transport economist at the World Bank. He will be speaking about the highway development and management model. Second will be Tom Russell and Jim Hall. Jim Hall is here with me. Tom Russell, Martin Humphries will be online, as you will see shortly. Both Tom and Jim are from Oxford University and will speak about providing transport decision makers with support tools to enable them prioritize interventions to deliver sustainable and resilient long-distance transport networks. The third presenter, Isaac Chingam-Zengerezi from Go Metro, will speak about the Africa Urban Mobility Observatory, or AUMO, that will promote use of big data to support inclusive, low-carbon mobility in African cities. So, Martin, you will be first. We will then have Tom, Russell, and Jim second, and then Isaac will make the third presentation. So over to you, Martin. Good to see you.
Great. Thanks very much, Henry, and good morning to everybody listening in. I'm just pulling up my screen. Let me know if you can see it. And we've gone into screen mode. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you very much to the organisers for inviting us to talk a little bit today about what we see as a particularly important programme that the World Bank has taken on with the support of the UK FCDO, the Asian Development Bank and others. And arguably, a little bit of note of contention to start here, one of the most important pieces in software in the developing, for development purposes, that there is out there at the moment. Maybe Jim would disagree, but I'll wait for the comment and the comeback on that after I finish my presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about ensuring the centrality of climate change in road management. My presentation is going to have 5 parts. I'm going to go through it pretty quickly. I'm very conscious of the time limits. This is a short version of a much longer presentation. Firstly, what is the highway development and management model? actually Henry has been, and it's very nice to see you again, Henry. Henry was instrumental in the development of this in its earlier iterations before he came to the World Bank, and I feel confident he's going to be closely involved in the latest iteration and the upgrade of that. And that's something we've discussed very briefly. So it'll be good to have you back on site, Henry. A short history of it, and then why it needs to be changed. The approach we're taking and the progress. Together with it, I think an indication of, one of the challenges or some of the challenges we face today in upgrading this particular piece of software. So, okay, so let's just start with what is the Highway Development Management Model. In its latest iteration, we call it the HDM4 version 2. It's a software package and associated documentation for road authorities around the world. It's intended to serve as the primary tool for the analysis, planning, management, and appraisal of investment decisions on the road network at 3 levels. It does a strategic level analysis of the whole network for the longer term budget planning under different budget scenarios, different maintenance strategies, with the objective of optimizing expenditures and trading off the level of service on the network against your expenditures over a longer period of time. Having undertaken that, you then drop down a level and you do a program level analysis, which is essentially the detailed maintenance planning for a single or multi-year, usually 3 to 5 maximum, maintenance program under different budget constraints. So what can you do in the short and medium term in terms of maintenance on the network, given your expected budget constraints under a medium-term expenditure framework? And then third, the more rudimentary project analysis to justify investment in a particular link on that network, whether to rehabilitate or completely upgrade. That would be something that the road authority would use this for, and indeed something that we, as the World Bank, together with the European Investment Bank, African Development Bank, and indeed the Asian Development Bank, together with a lot of bilaterals, would require them to do using HDM4 before any road component could be introduced in a project that would be financed by those institutions. So how does it do this? Well, very quickly, without going into the detail, it calculates the structural performance of the pavement, and you can see the little figure on the right here showing what we call the deterioration curve. Over time, pavement will deteriorate naturally and quicker depending on climate, terrain. And if you add traffic into that, it will further deteriorate, particularly if the traffic comprises heavy trucks, buses, which do much of the additional deterioration on the pavement. And you get to a certain point where the road is so rough, you start to get breakups, potholes, edge break in the pavement, and seals. And if they're not quickly sealed, obviously the road needs to be rehabilitated. And if you don't rehabilitate it, you're going to get a complete failure of the payment and a loss of the original investment. So the step here is the rehabilitation point, as you can see on the graph. Now, it's a sort of life cycle prediction model of deterioration given maintenance, weather, fleet composition, and traffic levels. And the cost-benefit analysis inherent in the model measures and assesses road user costs and benefits and agency costs and benefits over the project life. There was an attempt to bring in later iterations road user safety issues, but if I was being brutally honest, and without offending Henry and earlier colleagues, it's a sort of end of tailpipe calculation. You essentially take the predicted change and you calculate the value of the change, and then you put it back into the model. Equally, there's been similar end of tailpipe attempts to calculate the value of greenhouse gas emissions, but the problem often is that they're not central to the decision-making process, which relies on that below the line number in relation to user costs and agency costs and benefits. Having said that, currently 67 countries around the world hold a license for this, and that's actually gone down as the model has become older, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But it is seen as commercially independent and indeed much cheaper than the proprietary alternatives. And as I said earlier, it's a prerequisite to the provision of finance by the MDBs and indeed many of the bilaterals. Just to give you an indication of the scale and importance of this, we have 162 active transport projects in our portfolio, amounting to $31 billion, of which approximately 20 billion are for what we call connectivity projects, which would benefit from the use of HDM4 or a similar model for tertiary roads. Now, the idea is that the upgrade would include both primary, secondary, and tertiary roads. So there would be no need for two models. And our pipeline of connectivity projects alone is about 18 billion over the next 3 years. That's just the World Bank. So very brief history. This goes all the way back to 1968, actually, when Robert McNamara who was then president of the World Bank, challenged some of the World Bank economists to come up with a methodology that would allow him to get a sense of what the comparative costs and benefits were across World Bank projects. And at the same time, work was done both on the North Atlantic side of the US side of the North Atlantic, but also on the UK side. And it was TRL and the World Bank that did it, producing a highway cost model in 1971. And then there was a considerable amount of field work done in Kenya and Brazil, India, and other developing countries to test the empirical relationships that underpin HDM4. And then through numerous iterations, we came to essentially a HDM3, which was released in 1987, a PC-based version. And then the interface was improved further with the release of HDM4 Manager, which for anybody, and I'm old enough to have used it, for anybody to have used HDM3 will know it was an incredibly time-consuming and onerous business. But the problem was, even by 1993, and certainly by the end of that decade, when HDM4 version 1 and HDM4 version 2 came out in 2005, the needs for the model had changed markedly. In the 20 years since 2005, there's been a huge growth in other areas that need to be included within that, and a slow decline in the number of users, the number of license holders for the model, simply because it doesn't meet their functionality. And of course, the top three here, I touched on GHG emissions earlier and how we have attempted to use a Heath Robinson approach to measure the impact of GHG emissions in our projects with a sort of end of tailpipe model. But climate change, resilience, GHG emissions, all of these need to be put within the model so that they're central to the decision-making process. In addition to that, I think road safety needs to be included more centrally. And then as I mentioned earlier, we're looking to include tertiary roads. So it'll be primary, secondary, tertiary in the model for the first time. The wider economic benefits as defined by the Green Book in the UK. That's something we're working on at the moment to ensure we can at least provide default values where available, or come up with default values or a recommended range of values for TTLs, for potassium leaders in the World Bank to consider. So they will be included within the model. And then we'll be looking to index the value of time and life in the model. Previously, you had to essentially take the value out, calculate the impact of growth in GDP in real terms, and then on an Excel spreadsheet, come up with an average and then put it back into the model. Obviously, not entirely satisfactory. And then finally, of course, the model was written in C++ for a PC-based platform, a Windows-based platform, and that's a little antiquated now, with most of the software we have being delivered as a sort of software as a service. And the idea is that the new HDM5 in inverted commas will be such a model, and that of course will allow us both to provide a better service to the client, so updates can be pushed to them as it is with your Apple phone, Apple iPad or Apple Watch, but more importantly, it potentially allows us a tremendous source of comparable data around the world that we can use for research, both on the road cost side, but also on other areas that we have only really started to think about yet. And then we had the current license actually expired on August 2022. And I think we are now working on a sort of temporary rolling basis with the existing licensee and the license provider. And there's a little bit of an issue on the intellectual property rights for the model we won't go into here. But that's going to be rolled over for the next 2 years or so until we can actually upgrade the model. So let me just talk very briefly about the approach. This is the way the World Bank has taken on the challenge, given that we were asked to do this by the UK FCDO and ADB. We have a small project management team who are working on different work streams with technical input underneath. We have some technical advisors on the outside, you can see, and I'm looking at the figure on the right here. And then we have a HDM steering committee that is very small, very agile, and has met actually once, I think twice at the moment. And then other contributors are pulled in as needed. Work that's undergoing at the moment is a more detailed survey of users and experts who've used it, partly to assess what they want to see in the updated HDM5 model. What improvements have been made to the model by others, because this model has actually been taken on by some states in Canada and the US. It's been taken on by some developed countries and some middle-income countries, and they have already made changes to the model. And they've taken it on themselves and started developing it themselves. And those changes obviously would save us quite a lot of money, and also provide maybe some input into the conceptual process. And then we're updating, extending the business plan, because that will be part of the new licensing concession process, addressing the IP issues as I've talked about, but most importantly, designing the IT platform. And I think here, you know, if I come up with a very simple analogy, you know, we have to build a house, and then we have to add sufficient rooms for the additional modules such as resilience, GHG emissions, and climate change. And then we are essentially establishing technical work streams consistent with the budget to undertake the process.
2 minutes speaking, please.
2 minutes, okay. Well, I'm going to then skip this very quickly because this essentially gives you an indication of the funding. I mean, I'll just briefly touch on the estimated cost. It looks as though we are close to, at the moment, with in-kind and trust fund contributions, to getting somewhere close to $3 million. So I think whilst we don't have money to complete all of it, and certainly, you know, the piloting, the training, the rollout, I think we'll have to do from the different institutional budgets going forward. We appear to be close to what we need. Obviously, that's before we start the work, and as with anything, I'm sure it's going to cost more in the process than it is at this particular stage in time. Current status. Just to go through, I think the bottom few. The legal review has been done. We know where we are in relation to the intellectual property rights, given the different contributions to the development of the model. We know what we need to do to survey that. I mentioned the survey of users, road administrations, and the business plan update that's been done by the HVT program. Thank you very much to them and the UK FCDO. The TOR for the IT architecture is complete, and we are hoping to launch the procurement process either in December or in January of next year. And then you know, the scoping papers for each of the areas, the technical committees that will naturally follow. Just in relation to the complementary work, I mentioned the value of time work and the wider economic benefits. We also have work going on the value of statistical life and a similar meta-analysis on the value of time for freight. And that's starting at the moment, funded by the ADB under the same umbrella. I'm not going to go through that in detail. You can see it on the slide there. And I think, Emma, I've exactly hit the deadline. That's it. Thank you very much indeed. Let me hand it back to you, Henry.
Thank you very much, Martin. We'll just... I hope you heard that applause, Martin. We will
Tragically,
just
no, I did. Tragically, I know I didn't, but I could see Jim and your hands moving, so I assumed.
Okay. Well, a little appreciation for the excellent presentation. Before we go to the next session, are there any clarifying questions that you would like Martin to answer now? We will have a more in-depth Q&A session at the end, at least for 15-20 minutes. But if there's anything of a burning question that you need Martin to answer now, I've just looked at the slide. Oh. Okay. I think there's just one that's come in, whether the methods and models are open source. Will they help people develop complementary analysis? So if you want to answer that now, Martin, otherwise we can take that at the end as well.
Yeah, no, it's not going to be open source. I think the idea of the three partners in the steering committee together with BIAC is this would be available because of the cost of developing it and the cost of continuing to develop after the initial launch. It's going to be provided on a not-for-profit basis and maintained by an institution on that basis. I would say that the APIs will be available for purchase. So I think there is an opportunity for people to buy the APIs and develop them for their own purpose.
Thank you very much, Martin. All right, so we'll move to our second session, which will be presented by Tom Russell, who is joining us online, and by Jim Hall, who is here with me. Both are from Oxford University and have been working on the HVT project to develop decision support systems for resilient transport management. So you're going to speak a little first and then hand over to Tom. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you very much indeed, and hopefully the slides will come up in a moment. But just by way of introduction, it's very appropriate that I'm presenting this project which was done as part of the HVT program within this session and series, which is supported by the Climate Compatible Growth, which my team in Oxford are also involved in, because in a sense there's a handshake here between the analysis which we're presenting in East Africa now, which was developed with HVT, analysing the resilience of transport networks, which is now being passed into the CCG programme and will form the starting point for transport resilience analysis into CCG partner countries, Kenya and Uganda. And the types of tools I'm presenting are very much in line with the CCG starter kit concept, in the sense that we're developing open data sets to inform decision making, in this context in relation to transport network resilience. I should also say briefly in response to Martin, what I'm presenting in no way compares with the amount of reach that HDM4 has had over the years, and I think there's an enormous amount to be learned from a tool like that, which has had uptake in more than 60 countries. I think you'll see in what we're presenting a slightly different philosophy, maybe I'll even dare say a more modern philosophy, in that we're working with large-scale data sets, in many senses globally available data sets, which then provide the starting data for open analysis with open codes, Python codes, and then more accessible web-based tools. I should also acknowledge, thanks to Martin, in many senses, he was at the start of the journey which my group have been on, in that we did a lot of infrastructure and systems analysis in Britain, and then the World Bank and Martin and Stefan Halgat, Julie Rosenberg and others pushed us to work in Tanzania to start with, to apply this type of analysis in Tanzania. And that was a start of a journey which is really bearing fruit in many parts of the world now. So that was quite a long introduction to give us time to get the slides up, and here they are. I wonder whether I can move them on with this remote control. Does that work? Point to the back. Am I holding it? Maybe. Okay, it's working. Brilliant. So these pictures just really show the context of what we're talking about, why the resilience of transport networks is such an important challenge. A number of different levels. Here we're seeing valuable assets being destroyed, literally being washed away. So that constitutes large financial asset losses, safety losses, and also major interruptions to the economic activities and real shocks to development in countries where these types of disaster take place. So, there we go. I'll just, okay, keep going. I'll just give you a wave when I need the next slide, which is now. So that disasters like that pose a number of different questions, and which are needed in order to think about and prioritize adaptation actions. So where are those vulnerable infrastructure assets? What are the climate hazards that they're exposed to? What might be the direct damages and then wider economic losses due to climate hazards? How might those risks change in the future in the context of a changing climate? Then what are the options to enhance the resilience? And how then can those investments be prioritized to reduce climate risks? And the analysis we're presenting goes through answers to each of those questions. As I say, this is part of the HVT program, and our focus is on Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, and Zambia. The work is led by the University of Southampton, and I should also say that the work being done in Southampton looks at broader aspects of transport network resilience and sustainability, including questions of emissions and safety. The overall conceptual framework is illustrated here, and I'll go through each of these steps in a moment. But in some senses, this is a fairly conventional now geospatial risk analysis, in that we take layers of climate-related hazards, intersect that with high-resolution data on the location of transport assets, look at the potential damage using depth damage functions for every one of those assets, then do large numbers of simulations of potential damage scenarios. For each one of those, look at the amount of disruption to transport flows, and hence the wider economic losses, and we aggregate those up to come up with probabilistic risk estimates. Then one begins to think about what are the adaptation options, impose those on the network and see how much you get the risk down by, and that is the benefit of adaptation, forming the basis for prioritization. The hazard that we focus upon in Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, Uganda, as part of HVT has been flooding, where because of the extensive and repeated evidence of damage from flooding to transport networks. So I'll quickly skip through each stage within this. First of all, using high-resolution flooding data sets from rivers, coastal, surface water flooding. and at a range of different return periods and a range of different climate scenarios in the future. Then that is intersected with transport network data. Now, in many senses, we have an abundance of riches these days, in particular with OpenStreetMap. But on the other hand, when one starts looking at data sets like that in detail, you see that they're full of flaws, frankly. Also, when we speak to our partners in African countries, they have their own data sets that need to be integrated within this. There's a lot more that can be done in terms of crowdsourcing. So actually with CCG support, we're embarking on, and in fact partway through with our partners in Southampton, an exercise of assembling all of the railway data in Africa, which has been a painstaking exercise of scraping data from PDF documents as well as using the very partial data which is in OSM. We went through this exercise, and then the next step is to put that into topologically correct networks. Everything needs to join up if you're going to do the transport systems analysis, and that in itself is a time-consuming business. Then attributed to those networks, we're adding information around road types, speeds, surfacing types, dimensions, embankments, bridges, culverts, and so on. And so this begins to give some of the evidence here now also for the ports within the network, as well as the railways and the roads, and the airports as well. The next aspect of this is to look at the exposure of that entire transport network and all of those transport assets to the floods at a range of different return periods. This looks at return periods here along the x-axis and the flooded length of roads at different points in the future and for different RCP scenarios. So this gives some sense of the scale of the climate threat to the transport network under different future scenarios. And this is flooded lengths of railways, again, under future scenarios. Then we try to estimate what the extent of damage will be in those different scenarios using depth damage functions like this one. And that enables us to estimate, again, at a range of different return periods and for different climate scenarios, what the expected direct damages are, and this is in millions of US dollars, so we're talking billions of dollars of potential damage to the road network in those different scenarios. And this is, again, looking at the impacts for railways. The next part of this is then looking at the wider economic impacts. So if a part of the network is severed, that means that there may be large rerouting costs, and in African countries where the highway network is relatively sparse, the rerouting costs can be vast, or certain parts of the network can become totally inaccessible. So that has large economic losses in terms of the economic activities which are impacted. And so we're then totaling all of these things up for rivers, railways, roads, and on the coast as well, at present and in the future. And these are expected annual damages, so these are aggregated over a range of different return periods. So this is the average loss which one would expect every year going into the future. So then we need to look at what are the adaptation options, and using a similar rationale to HDM4, which we've just heard about, Here we're looking at, on the one hand, what are the benefits of risk reduction? That's above the line. And because the climate risk is going up into the future, the benefit of risk reduction goes up into the future. And we compare that against the cost of adaptation, the maintenance costs, and the intermittent upgrade costs for a range of different adaptation options. And these are the types of options we're talking about. Some of these photos, obviously not from Africa. But we have imposed these options across the 4 HVT countries. This is in Kenya. And you can get some sense of this, of what a large-scale analysis this is, in terms of looking at every one of a range of different options for every section in the network in order to come up with the benefits of avoided losses, the costs of investment in adaptation, and then the benefit-cost ratios. And the wider those lines are, the more beneficial they are, and that provides the basis for prioritization. And you can see the different categories of intervention along the bottom there: swales, spillways, flood embankments, flood walls, drainage, upgrading, and so on. So this is really quite a granular analysis in terms of the types of options that are being imposed, and the capacity we have to prioritize very vigorously across the network. And what we find is that if you look at the benefit-cost ratios, and this is a log scale here, you probably can't see the scale very well, but what to look at is the red line, which is a benefit-cost ratio of 1. So the ones above the line are worth doing, the ones below the line are not economically viable. And you can see that there's a massive range here in terms of the benefit-cost ratios. And some of these interventions are highly cost beneficial. These are really where adaptation investments need to be happening very soon in order to enhance resilience and ensure that economies and communities are not utterly disrupted by the impact of climate change. Whereas for many of the other investments, one has to look rather more cautiously in terms of, is this the best option? And some of these options are clearly much more cost beneficial than others. And when should this intervention actually be done? And maybe there are some cases, there's a case for delaying expenditure in some places whilst prioritizing it in other places. So the overview here is these are the types of metrics which the analysis provides. And I will now hand over to Tom Russell, who's going to provide a quick walk through the online tool which enables this analysis and provides access to this for anyone who wants to explore the results and do the analysis. So I hope we can switch over to Tom now.
Okay, can you hear me and see
Yes.
my screen as shared the tool?
Yes, we can. And we see the screen.
Excellent. Okay, thanks, Jim. Yeah, I'm going to give a brief walkthrough of the online tool, which both presents the risk and resilience and adaptation analysis results that Jim's just walked through, and gives a way of looking at this more sustainability, the broader sustainability assessment that the team at Southampton, Simon Blaney and Adrian Hickford and others have worked on. So I'm going to focus on the risk and resilience side just today, but the tool is open and available. It's at east-africa.infrastructureresilience.org. I'm happy to share that link. There's not in its final version yet, but pretty close. We've got a few more weeks just to close out the work on this under this current project. So as I said, yeah, systemic risk assessment tool developed by Southampton and the University of Oxford, funded through the High Volume Transport Programme by UK Aid, and builds significantly upon a previous project that we finished earlier this year in Jamaica, also funded by UK FCDO. So the bulk of the tool is an interactive web map. So you can control the different infrastructure layers and look at the hazards on the left here. So if I bring in under roads, I'll bring in motorway, trunk and primary. Hopefully these will load reasonably quickly. Yep. So there's the major road network. And if we bring in river flooding, for example, you can see these are the data sets that we're working with. So under river flooding here, we're looking at a 1 in 100 year flood in present baseline conditions. But we could look at a much more frequent, less intense flood, or a much less frequent, more intense flood, and see how that changes out into the future under different climate scenarios. So you can hover over these grid cells, which are the outputs of the WRI aqueduct flood hazard model. So we're treating their data as one of the key inputs to our work here. That's the input data sets. That's the basic overlay of what we do when we intersect the assets with the hazards. You can click on any one of the road links to bring in some of the attributes that we know about that particular road, and to bring up the specific risk results that we've calculated. So here we've plotted the expected annual damages in the baseline and into the future, and the expected annual economic losses. So here damages are the direct damages to the roads, and economic losses are those losses from transport rerouting costs or lost economic activity that we've estimated through the transport model. So that's under expectation, and you can also look at that for the various return periods, again, in current day and out into the future under different climate scenarios. That's the detail bit. What you can also do is zoom out and toggle hazards off for this. We can look at the map of the road network, coloured by direct damages from river flooding. So here the grey links are not affected by river flooding in our model, and the yellow through red to dark black links are suffering increased direct damages from river flooding here. And you can look at that across direct damages or the economic loss estimation for the different hazards and the total. So from here, you can get the overview over the network and zoom quickly to look at areas that you that either stand out as suffering high losses or are particularly important to you. So the final step in the risk and adaptation analysis is looking at those adaptation options that Jim discussed. So from here, you can look at any one road class at a time. And in the table on the right, we've got all of the roads sorted by the avoided direct damages from introducing drainage rehabilitation. So that's looking at avoided risk. You can look at the cost of adaptation options. So this is the estimated cost of applying a particular adaptation option to the length of road that is exposed to flooding. And you can look at that cost benefit ratio. So I guess this is a little small on the screen as you see it there. But if you bring it on a desktop, it's nice and clear. And you can either look here in the table to see the sorted list of most cost beneficial options. And if we click on one, all being well, we'll be able to zoom into that particular place if my buttons work. If they don't, no worries, it's a live demo. Sometimes these things don't quite come off. It's highlighted in blue. We've highlighted in blue just here, and we can zoom to the specific link. And if you click on that link and come back to asset type, then we can look in the details box over here and see in detail the results for this particular link as calculated for each of the different adaptation options. How am I doing for time? I should probably wrap up.
I was just about to rudely interrupt you, but if you want to wrap up in the next 30 seconds.
Thanks, Henry. Yeah, well, that's pretty much the whistle-stop tour through the tool. Plenty of caveats we could give about the data and the methodology in more detail, but the tool's meant to openly provide direct insight and transparent insight into the analysis that we've done, and go from that overview of the network and drill right into the details of what's driving the results that you see. It's freely and openly available online, and all the data and underlying codes are open, and I can point you in that direction if that's interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to Tom and Jim. In the interest of time, we will come back to the questions after the third presentation. I can tell you that there are over 10 questions that have come in on Slido, so rather than attempting to answer all of them now, we'll bunch them up, and I would encourage those who are online to like the questions, then we will be able to give priority to those that are most liked. All right, our final presentation is by Isaac Chingamzengereza from Go Metro. So Isaac, over to you. I don't want to steal your thunder by describing your program, so maybe you'll start with that. I'm sure you will. Over to you.
Thank you, Henry. I hope you can all hear me there.
It's loud and clear.
And also, all right, I'll just also share my screen now. I hope you can see it.
It says starting. Yes, it's coming now.
Can you see it? Can everyone see it?
Go ahead to the first slide. Let's see what it looks like. Okay, perfect.
Can you see it now, everyone? Thank you very much, Henry. As you have already introduced me, my name is Isaac Mzengereza. I am based here in Malawi. I am a transport engineer for Go Metro. It's a South African intelligent transport systems company. I'm here today to present to you on the Africa Urban Mobility Observatory. As an introduction, the HVT Africa Urban Mobility Observatory project is funded by the UK aid, and it is part of the second phase of the High Volume Transport Research program, and it is managed by DT Global. It is implemented by a consortium of partners that include Go Ascendo, UN Habitat, Wapata Institute, UEMI, Heather Allen, and Gail Jennings. The project attempted to answer several research questions that are threefold. With regards to policy levers, we wanted to find out what are the main levers for transport modes share. What is the role of data? What cities have achieved high or low transit ridership, cycling, etc. And what factors, policies explain their differences. The other layer was on big data technology. And the research question was that what are the opportunities and risks of big data application in the Global South cities? And then lastly, on informal paratransit, what is the role of informal transport in the Global South, and how to enable transition towards clean, affordable, efficient transport systems? The project was being implemented in several cities in Africa, and it was in Blantyre in Malawi, Gaborone in Botswana, Kigali in Rwanda, Kinshasa in DRC, Lagos in Nigeria, and Masere in Lesotho. The ecosystem of the observatory consisted of travelers who are traveling all over this city jurisdiction, looking for economic opportunities in search for services, and also just social travel, that is to see relatives or tourism travel. And then using our methods or methodologies, we captured data on the travel experiences of these travelers. And then this data was processed into a format that can be used by local planning authorities for management, regulation, and policy formation with regards to transport systems in these jurisdictions. The indicators that were identified to give us insight or to give us intelligence as to what is happening with regards to transport in these cities, as indicated there on the slide. I'll not mention all of them, I'll just mention a few of them. There's travel time, there's vehicle occupancy, there's sexual harassment, there's modus place, there's CO2 emissions, congestion, affordability, and accessibility. There were several or a couple of data collection methods. One of them was the conventional field surveys. So in this methodology, it was the usual or traditional questionnaire, only that depending on which city, the questionnaire was translated into local language and then loaded onto a cell phone and then handed over to an enumerator who would go and strategic transport interchanges to intercept the travelers, and then they would run the questionnaire. So the table below there shows some of the response. For instance, for Blantyre, there were like 451 respondents, and then after cleaning the data, came to 442. And then on the last two columns there on that table is the cost per city. So that we see and compare how much it costs to collect this data depending on which city that you're conducting this survey. And then the other methodology was the USSD methodology. USSD is a communication protocol compatible with all GSM devices. So it has got a maximum session of up to 80 seconds, depending on the mobile network operator. The maximum screen characters, the number of characters that can be accommodated per screen is about 160. And then shared USD channels often charge the user per session. Now, to initiate this USSD survey, the user must dial a code on their phone. And then to recruit these respondents, a specially defined targeted SMS marketing campaign was conducted. The mobile network operators sent SMSs with the participation instructions to subscribe based on their location. So depending on the travel analysis zones that we identified, the mobile network users sent targeted messages in those using their transmission towers in those travel analysis zones as a marketing SMS. And then some of the key findings in Blantyre, for instance, we used TNM as our mobile network operator, and then in Lagos we used the MTN. There were about 100,000 marketing SMSs that were sent in each of these cities. And then as an incentive, there was an airtime that was promised to those that those that would finish the survey of about 20 cents British pounds. And then there on the table there, you see in Blantyre the number of in-city surveys, and then there's the number that finished 80% of the survey, and then the number that finished the whole survey. So you would see that the number differs. It looks like some people inserted the survey, but then did not complete. According to our research or what we found out is that because of the screen timeouts, we suspect that when somebody initiated the survey, they couldn't finish because there was no time. The screen time was so limited that they couldn't finish the survey. So you would see both for Blantyre and Lagos, when somebody initiated the survey, some of them couldn't finish, but there were some still who finished the survey. And then, below there's a table that just compares the cost of conducting this USSD service between Blantyre and Lagos. And then there was also another methodology, the WhatsApp surveys. This is the usual WhatsApp survey, WhatsApp application that we use on our phones. The good thing with this methodology is that there's no time restriction. You can be on the screen there for as long as you like. And also the character limit per screen is a bit higher at 4,096 characters. So to initiate the survey, the user had to send a message to a particular number. To recruit the respondents, there was also a marketing campaign that was done. And then for the WhatsApp participants, there was no that was offered due to budget constraints. And the table below there shows the number of initiated surveys, the number that completed 80% of the survey, and the number that completed 100% of the survey in Blantyre and Lagos. So we can see there the numbers for the survey, for the WhatsApp surveys were quite low. We would like to think that it was so low because there was no any incentive to participate in this survey. So below there's another table that shows the comparison, of course, of running this WhatsApp survey between Blantyre and Lagos. And then another method that we used to collect data in these cities was to use the UMA, which is the user movement analytics. So the Go Metro has got an SDK which can be integrated into any application, and you just have to update that application. Then that SDK gets integrated with that application. Then you can be tracked. It is passive and it is very anonymous. It is anonymous just for the sake of data privacy. So the user has to grant permission for their origin and destination, their travel time, their trip distances, their latitude and longitude, or just their geolocation, their trips, their journey stages, and so on and so forth. So on the right there is just like a graphic of what it looks like. It's a graphic for Cape Town. This is one of the surveys that we carried out in Cape Town, and the graphics look like that when it's complete. As I've already said before, this methodology has got the SDK, but also there is a standalone app that is on the Google that you can upload you can upload or you can install on your device, and can be used to track your movements, just to come up with a trip diary. Normally, the participants were tracked for 7 days. To recruit the participants or the respondents or the participants, a marketing campaign was also carried out for 5 days per city. And there was an incentive of airtime that was offered to the participants. The marketing campaign was done via Facebook, and below there is a table that shows how many people saw the marketing campaign on Facebook, and then how many people clicked it, and how many people downloaded the app, and then how many people registered for the survey, and then how many people completed the survey. And then there's also at the end there, the 2 columns shows the cost of running that survey using user movement analytics. As you can see, there were very few people that completed this survey. Our thinking is that this is a quite new way and quite suspicious way of collecting data, especially in the Global South. So there might have been some apathy as to the idea of being tracked and your movement being recorded by someone that you can't even see. So I would like to believe there was some sort of apathy. That's why there were very few completed UMA surveys. And then this slide is the last slide. It just shows the cost comparison of the different surveys per city. For instance, for Blantyre, the cost for a field survey, USSD, WhatsApp, and UMA, as compared to all the other cities that this project was being carried in. So that is the table. And that is the end of my presentation. If there are any questions, I'm available for those. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isaac. Once again. Thank you. Once again, we'll give you a few minutes if there are any burning questions for Isaac. Otherwise, we'll move straight to the open Q&A session. A reminder that please use Slido. There have been quite a few questions that have come in, including one that was asking what is CCG. And for those who may have missed the beginning, it's the Climate Compatible Growth Program that is financed by the UK's FCDO. Okay, so I hope we'll take that question out. It's been liked by a few people, so I hope we won't have to trouble our presenters. Isaac, do you want to look through the Slido and have a look at the questions that are specific to you? I've shared the Slido here with Jim and Martin as well. If you do have the link, please look at Slido. But in the meantime, Martin, I'll come to you since you've been the one having to wait the longest. Would it be possible to get access to the data, equations, and methods for HDM4, not the code, because that's understandably proprietary. So, Martin, if you want to start with that. In the meantime, I give Isaac, Tom as well, if you can have a look at Slido, and then I'll come to Jim.
Yeah, certainly the methods or a detailed explanation of the baseline equations or the fundamental equations in HDM4 are available. If you remember on my second slide, I showed the 5 volumes, which are actually the 5 volumes that allow people to understand how the model works for the different models. There's an introductory one, and there's one for the road deterioration equations. That explains fully how the model works. The data, no. Quite frankly, many of the countries regard this data to be confidential, and we, the bank, would obviously regard it under our access to information policy as being something that we can't make public. It's something that our client shares with us under what we call a deliberative basis, unless it's for research purposes. And indeed, I think when Jim mentioned the criticality analysis that was done in Tanzania, and obviously for that, we shared the HDM4 network and fleet composition, traffic volumes by link with Jim and his team when they were doing that. And that's something I think we also did in Argentina. Those were 2 of the earlier ones that I was involved in. So yeah, not public certainly, but the understanding of how the existing model works is public. And that's in the 5 volumes available on the public and indeed online on the bank website.
Thank you, Martin. Jim, you've picked some questions.
Yes, so there are a number of questions on what was presented there. The first related to an observation that our focus was on asset hardening, asset strengthening, and the question was, well, should one simply think of having a series of prioritized secure routes within the network? And in a sense, this is where the analysis points one, that there's a very wide range of costs and in particular benefits the different points of intervention within the network. So in effect, it is pointing one towards having particular priority routes which are in effect climate proofed. Now, that, however, is a very difficult choice to make, and we've already identified that the high volume transport network is a relatively sparse network in East Africa in any case, and there's a very high level of economic dependence upon it. So I think one needs to be kind of really cautious about the trade-offs involved. And in a sense, that's why this type of analysis is so important. I wouldn't kind of, it is, however, advisory, and we need to take account of the big picture also of the social functions of the transport network, and aspects of access to essential services, and in rural areas, the importance of transport connectivity as well. I suppose that the message coming out of this, and this is a message from Sharm el-Sheikh this week, though we knew it already, is that there are very hard choices entailed in adaptation, and it is costly, and don't believe the glib statements that all adaptation is wildly cost beneficial. That is not the case. One has to make very difficult choices, and that's what this type of analysis is pointing us towards. Sorry, I will move on a little bit more quickly now. There's a question around access to the tools. As we said, the code is all open source. You can find it on the GitHub site associated with my group in Oxford, OPSIS, the Oxford Programme for Sustainable Infrastructure Systems. And Tom showed you the URL to the tool, so that's accessible as well. As we say, as far as possible, we're working with open data, freely available data, in which case that data is completely accessible too. But as Martin has pointed out, in some instances the data is licensed from governments. There are also some other better private data products like flood data products. So not all of the data to do this analysis as best one possibly can is freely available, though I think the world is on a journey towards making the best data freely available. There's a question around rerouting, and I think the questioner pretty much got to the answer as well in the question, in the sense that this is calculated as in terms of distance and average speed. But I also pointed out that in some instances there are no rerouting options, and then what we do in that case is look at the economic value of the trade, and hence the daily economic loss associated with that amount of trade being disrupted. I'm just quickly scanning down the list before I hand over to Tom. The final question I noted was in terms of how many countries. So within HVT was Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Zambia. The analysis has been applied in some detail with the World Bank in Vietnam, and also for all of Southeast Asia for a high-level tool which was launched at COP last year. As Martin mentioned, in Argentina, we've done a series of studies in the Caribbean as well, in Jamaica, St. Lucia, Curacao, some analysis of this type in Ghana and in Bangladesh. And in a couple of days' time, a little plug here, a global version of this analysis, the so-called Global Resilience Index, will be launched here. So that again is the journey that we're on towards making this type of analysis available globally, and then via CCG, the starter kits of data to get people doing it in particular countries.
Tom, do you have any questions that you want to pick up?
I think Jim picked up pretty much everything relevant to us. There was a question about system loss as well as asset loss and alternative routing, which, just to repeat that we do calculate those rerouting costs. In the cost model for transport costs, there's a little bit of estimation of a generalized cost of transport that brings in value of time and hence road speed, but also other estimates of other parameters that I can't list off the top of my head for the tariff cost of transporting different goods. And there was an interesting question about, could we use these methods for predictive planning to optimize new routes based on both resilience and transport benefit? And the answer is yes, to some extent. It's not what we do, and it's not what you can do with the tool. But it points in that direction a little bit. So there's the question of, with a new route in mind, could you introduce that into the model? How would that affect transport flows? And what assumptions would you make around that route in terms of resilience and how that would be potentially exposed to climate hazards? In the East African analysis, we did introduce future rail routes where we had some idea of rail developments in the region and looked at the potential exposure of those lines to flooding, and actually found that with the geometries that we had available, there was some considerable exposure of the new standard gauge rail, for example, in Kenya and Tanzania, considerable exposure to some bits of flooding, which you would want to look at in more detail with more detailed route geometries and understanding of protection levels and so on. But yeah, it's an interesting way forward. Thanks. I think Martin and Isaac both have questions.
Yep. Thank you, Tom. I think I see an opportunity for collaboration between the HDM4 and what you're doing here in terms of transport costs and how to do alternative routes and so on. Before we go back to Martin, Isaac, there's a question on privacy. Do the security agencies use user movement analysis to track people, and what have you done to address those concerns? Isaac?
Yeah. Hello?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Can you hear me? All right. I think the question was like, no, they don't. This one is a private owned application or technology that is not given to any security agencies. We at COMET to understand the sensitivities with regards to censorship and tracking. So wouldn't lend this or give this technology to agencies that we're not pretty sure as to how they're going to use this technology. So no, the NSA doesn't use UMA. Also, I saw another question on Slido. It says, have you contacted the Stats Ministry to collect the data in the future? It's their job to collect the useful data. As one of the items for this project, we conducted a workshop where the participants included Blantyre City authorities, it included Ministry of Transport authorities, National Planning Commission. And this is just regards to Malawi, where we tried to find out how we can sustain this exercise. Due to budget limitations, we couldn't do as much. It was just a pilot project. But then we look forward to seeing these local transport authority using these methodologies to go on and collect data and use it for regulation planning, or whatever they want to do with it with regards to transport. So not necessarily the stats ministry, but quite useful or quite relevant stakeholders that we did the workshop with, and with the view of sustaining this exercise. Actually, we are in the process of coming up with an action plan for Blantyre to sustain this exercise. So yes, there is hope that there will be continuity of collection of this data. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Isaac. Martin, do you want to come in on any of these questions?
Yeah, thanks very much, Henry. I wanted to unashamedly use a question that I think was directed at Professor Hall and the team, and that is, can these tools be used with minimum support by clients? And build on that with a couple of other points. I mean, first of all, HDM4 obviously has been used by our client countries for the last 30 or 40 years in different iterations with support. I mean, there's training in the rollout, there's beta testing, there's constant support, both in the form of new training, but also in problem solving from the institutions involved. The one thing I would say is that, and I'm sure Jim would agree with me, that these are mutually exclusive approaches. I think if you look at it in Jim's criticality analysis, and obviously this was done in Tanzania, primarily the impact is pluvial and fluvial flooding. And that isn't the only impact that we'll get from climate change. We'll get wind, we'll get extreme heat, we'll get increased incidence of extreme storms in places like Mozambique, maybe not in Tanzania, but certainly further south. Durban and Cape Town lose anywhere between 30 and 90 days a year because of wind at the moment. That's likely to increase. All of this needs to come into a model. And I think the challenge actually is ensuring that the module, if you like, in something like HDM4, or also in relation to the comment about new roads and new sections, it comes into the sort of strategic planning exercises that countries and regions do. I mean, in addition to HDM4, one of the other things I'm working on at the moment is, I have a regional freight model covering, together with the team, covering the Southern African countries. And that's everything from Tanzania, DRC, right the way down to South Africa. And that goes up to 2050. And what we're looking at the moment, and I'm talking to CCG, and Mark, I think, is in the room, how do we bring in the resilience model of this type in terms of a scenario within that? We can look at the change in demand for different commodities over that period because of climate change and decarbonization. We can look at what happens in relation to a road to rail policy if there's a specific difference in the pricing regime. And I think it would be particularly interesting to look at, a criticality assessment across a regional arena, because then you're starting to look at, okay, which port needs to have additional capacity to build up resilience, which adjacent routes on this essential freight network, because, quite honestly, it's the freight networks that drive economic growth in many of the countries in Southern Africa. So let me stop there and see if Jim disagrees or agrees. And if it's the latter, Jim will be happy to work with you, assuming FCDO pays.
Thanks for that, Martin. And yeah, entirely agree. And firstly, in just going back to the question of usability, we are talking about two quite different situations here, in the sense that, as Martin has said, HDM4 is a tool which has been used very widely, more than 60 countries. It has support and a very large user community, whereas the resilience analysis and the network risk analysis that I've showed is on its way out of a research group and is on a rapid trajectory of uptake and use, but we can't offer the level of support and training that HDM or FEM4 has provided over many, many years. Perhaps one of the parts of the conversation to have in the context of CCG and other programs is how that is all taken forwards. Agree entirely in relation to the multitude of hazards, and in other analyses we've been able to look at different sets of hazards. The Jamaican analysis, for example, that I mentioned, looked at hurricanes and droughts, as well as different varieties of flooding, and we've looked at different combinations of hazards in different places. And fascinated to hear about the regional freight model. One, I think, interesting addition to that I would mention is analysis of future shipping trade, which my group have done, Jasper Verschoor, using the OECD shipping model, and what that implies in terms of infrastructure investment in African ports. And the answer is that, at least according to some of the trade scenarios, it represents a vast amount of investment, sometimes up to 6% of GDP, going into ports on alone, if you're prepared to believe that. And that underlines again the need to get the climate resilience embedded within that up front to ensure that that infrastructure investment is also resilient to the climate impacts which that port infrastructure will face.
Thank you very much, Jim. In the remaining 5 minutes, I'd like to use the chair's prerogative to ask one question to each of the session presenters. First one will go to Isaac. In terms of big data, we've seen a lot of big data, particularly use of mobile data for analysis of transport and other systems. What kind of challenges do low-income countries have in using big data? For those of you who may not know big data, it's a collection of, in the case of mobile users, all mobile users being tracked anonymously. So, Isaac.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for that question. The experience of this project showed us a lot of challenges that big data faces in Africa or in the global south. First of all is the cell phone penetration. There's quite low cell phone penetration in Africa. So for you to get a good representative sample is quite a challenge. Another challenge is the, for instance, for some of the sessions, you have to use the mobile data. So it's quite expensive in Africa to buy and use mobile data. Another challenge is the general lack of analysis with regards to data scientists to be able to. There's almost, in some cases, non-existent infrastructure to support big data.
All right, thank you, Isaac. In 1 minute each, if I may, first of all, Martin, what are the biggest challenges you feel for a finance minister who has to consider transport, health, and education? Does HDM help in any way? In 1 minute, please.
Gosh, in 1 minute. Certainly HDM will allow you to come up with a trade-off between investment in maintenance or investment and level of service. And hopefully, if the same appraisal methodologies are used in the health and education sector, which may or may not be the case. I mean, there are very few countries, unfortunately, that use a consistent approach to appraisal across all their sectors. They will get a sense under a medium-term expenditure framework of where the the most appropriate return will come from the modest funds that may or may not be available to the Ministry of Finance at any one particular time. Let me stop there.
Thank you for keeping to the 1 minute. And finally, Jim and Tom, with the unpredictability of climate change and evolving technologies, are return periods still valid? So when you talk of a 100-year or 500-year return period, are we not seeing them more frequently than those periods?
Well, let me pass to Tom first to see whether you have any closing remarks.
So in response to that question briefly, with the analysis that we've looked at, the return period that you see in the baseline, 50-year or whichever return period flood you look at, 50-year return period flood in the future will be of a different intensity and extent. So that's a measure of probability that applies in the baseline in the current day, and the frequency and intensity of extreme events will get worse in each of the climate scenarios in the future, with variation in different places. Underlying that, it is also of great interest to look at event-based analysis, where you can really look in more detail at the tail of the probability distribution. I'll stop there and hand back to Jim.
Just one very quick remark on that. So, first of all, the implication is right that climate change makes it more difficult to estimate these return periods, but it's still really important to look at the possibility of extreme shocks. But in the context of a changing climate, we can be completely surprised, and we have seen events which are just right off the return period scale, and that is some of what climate change is doing.
Thank you very much to all of our presenters. Once again, a quick round of applause to all of those, and appreciation to you as well as participants. And over to you, Erin, to close out.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Henry, for chairing. And please do join into our next session at 11, where we talk about macroeconomics. Thank you.